Hello, everyone. Welcome to this DSA panel discussion, which is in partnership between the International Development Department at the University of Birmingham and the Development Studies Association, which is the UK's membership association for those who study, research and teach in the field of development studies. If you're new to the DSA, there'll be some information put in the chat. My name's David Hudson. I'm Professor of Politics and Development and the head of department in Birmingham's International Development Department. And I'm very pleased today to be able to introduce our panel. We have 5 members. We have 4 at the moment, and the fifth and final one will be joining us halfway through because of another commitment. So I'm very pleased to introduce, first of all, Tamsyn Barton, who is the expert panel member to the InterAmerican Development Bank and former Chief Commissioner for the Independent Commission for Aid Impact in the UK, ICAI. Welcome, Tamsyn. I'd also like to introduce Romilly Greenhill, who's the CEO of Bond, which is the umbrella organisation for development NGOs in the UK. And previously, she was WAN's UK director. Welcome, Romilly. Third, I'd like to introduce Russ Hargrave, who's Politico's energy and climate editor, and he's written widely on the aid cuts recently, but also on Brexit and immigration as well. Hi, Russ. And fourth, I'd like to introduce Chris Lyon, Dr. Chris Lyon, who's an expert on global development and political theory here at the University of Birmingham and has recently written on realism and idealism in the politics of development. And I'm not quite sure which one we need more at the moment, whether it's realism or idealism. So thank you, Chris, for joining us. And then we'll also be joined by Jimm Fomunjong, who's from West African Civil Society Institute based in Ghana. And his work, he supports CSOs developing their strategies and is a former journalist and comms specialist as well. So welcome to everyone who's joining us. And for the first question, I'd like to go to Romilly. And when we were initially putting this panel together on the future of aid under the new Labour government, we had a very different set of questions in front of us, I think. And now, obviously, everything has changed. And my question to you was, should we have seen this coming?
I don't think we should, David. And I think if you look at where the government was last year in terms of the election, we had a really strong set of commitments in the manifesto about rebuilding the UK's reputation, rebuilding trust, modern partnership, equal partnerships, getting back to point 7, okay, when the fiscal situation allows. There was quite a strong set of commitments there. And then what we saw after Labour came in is actually there were a lot of really positive noises in the sort of autumn of last year. New development strategy launched. They appointed a former DFID PS to lead it. Fantastic woman, Manoush Shafiq, leading that. We had the UK's commitment to the World Bank. I was at the Labour Party conference. There were a lot of high-profile Labour MPs going around talking about Britain being back on the world stage. So I think, for that first sort of 6 months, I would say, the UK was showing pretty good leadership on many of the key issues. And certainly, they certainly weren't increasing ODA, but there was no indication that they were going to make such a drastic cut. And I think, a lot of Bond members and the people we work with around the world feel that there's a real sort of betrayal, to be honest, in terms of what was committed in manifestos versus the reality that's actually taken place.
And we can get into the politics of this as well, I think, as we go through. Tamsyn, I saw a 2-finger from you, which means you'd like to come in on the same point. So,
well, David, you were asking whether we might need realism or idealism at this point. And I always think that I'm something of a cynical idealist, if that's possible, because we have to be idealists to work in the space of development, but we also have to learn from experience. And while I totally take Romilly's point that, if we were to believe the government in what it originally said in its manifesto and some of its speeches, then we should be surprised. But actually, there were a lot of signs that wasn't necessarily the direction that they were going in. I think one of the most obvious was that there was the decision not to demerge, and the Foreign Secretary was put firmly in charge of development. It was very, very clear, despite what was argued during the election, that there was a fiscal black hole, which was putting a lot of pressure on and power to the Treasury to make decisions. And I think it was a very worrying sign when Cabinet was assembled and there was no mention of the development minister, and they seemed to have forgotten her nameplate. There were a lot of worrying signs, which I can remember commenting, at the time, suggested that priorities were not really in favour of development. And the speeches that were made by David Lammy really didn't talk about development. So that kind of left a vacuum, if you like, once the pressure came on to find money. And of course, with Trump moving into view in the White House and clear concern to try and appease him in relation to the risks of tariffs, then you could see why this might happen.
Yeah. Okay. And Russ and Chris, did you have any thoughts on this?
Well, if it's all right for me to jump in, thank you so much for having me, David, and DSA. It's a real pleasure to be here. I have something which may sound both optimistic and pessimistic compared to what Tamsyn and Romilly had to say. Should we be too surprised at the decision that got made? A little bit, because what was in the manifesto made a lot more positive noises. David Lammy looked like a very positive choice to go out and be a real sort of salesman for international aid and soft power. So, along with quite a few other manifesto pledges that we at Politico write about day in, day out, some of those have been ditched along the way, and so has this sort of gentle aid commitment. Here's possibly the good news. You can't really trust a word that Keir Starmer says, right? Like, we were going to get 28 billion quid a year for green transformation. That got absolutely screwed before the election because it was electorally unpopular. Louise Hay was going to be our transport minister. She got shoved out the door as soon as she became a liability. Like, you can start listing through all the ways that Keir Starmer has been extraordinarily ruthless when he's had to be. He's done that on having to sell, and I think Tamsyn's absolutely right. You're looking, there's one audience really for all of this, which is telling Trump that you're serious about arming NATO from the European side, and how do you find the cash in a hurry? You do it by cutting the aid budget. 2 years on, does the ruthless choice become, actually, we're losing support on our left-wing flank? Is it the kind of, the greeny Lib Dem seats that we've got to win back? Is that the point where we do start that reversal back towards 0.7, or maybe making positive noises about having a separate DFID? I don't think DFID's coming back, I have to be honest, but I suspect then you could do much more inside the FCDO, of course, to give it prominence. So there's the question about whether that comes down the line in a few years' time, if it's politically expedient. And what we know about Starmer is he will do what's politically expedient, even if he promised the opposite 6 weeks previously. So it may be that the winds suddenly start to kind of move in our direction again. Let's wait and see, but I wouldn't be too nervous right now.
Okay, Romilly, thank you, Russ.
I've been told this is an academic thing. We're saying it makes me look a bit like a sort of brownie guide, which I haven't been for many years. But I just wanted to come back to this point on sort of political expediency, because, there is this narrative that this is something that was supported by the public. And if you look overall across the headlines across the public, that is true. If you look at Labour voters, however, a larger number of Labour voters actually oppose this cut than support it. And obviously that's even more true in Lib Dem and Green voters. So I think, there was clearly the perception of a sort of political driver around this cut, and it's something being seen as popular with voters. It's popular with some kind of voters, but it's unclear, I think, whether those voters are actually going to become even more supportive of this government because of the aid cuts. Whereas actually, I think there is a real risk that some of those sort of core Labour voters are likely to drift off. And we've seen actually the trend over time in terms of the public to move in our favour. And a lot of people have said, and I think this is perfectly reasonable to say, yes, we did need to increase defence spending, but this was not the right way to do it. So it also partly depends on how you ask the question. So I think that risk is really real in terms of that drift that you talk about, Russell.
Yeah, and I think I would add on to that as well that just whether this is an important issue for people. So they might have a view on it, but is it going to change their voting behaviour or not? And I suppose the other question is who was the audience for this? Was it the UK public, or was it the US, possibly, and Trump? But I can see Jimm has joined us now, which is brilliant. Jimm, if I could just bring you in and ask you whether, from where you're sitting in Ghana in West Africa, whether you saw the aid cuts coming at all, or whether they came as a surprise to you and colleagues.
Thank you very much for this opportunity, and greetings to everyone here present. It came as a surprise, I must say. Particularly, when the wave blew from America to Europe, with many of these leaders taking what we saw as a new position that didn't really favor global aid. It really took us aback, particularly when at the time when, efforts were being made for more contributions, for more solidarity, particularly given that we are still coming out of a pandemic, the COVID pandemic, so with all of this on the back of our minds, we thought, we could build global solidarity, share perspectives, not only in terms of the work we are doing on the ground, but also in terms of new technologies, new ways of doing, particularly ways of doing leveraging from West Africa, where I live and work, but here is a situation where, from what we are observing, it's more of, a firm stance. It's our position versus what you're doing, irrespective of what you're doing. So it really took us aback. It is a great surprise. And I really think that, with conversations like this, with some degrees of engagement that are going on in different spheres, there will be some high-level reconsiderations to the current stance in an effort to make sure that the world is a better place, because it will be a better place for all. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Jimm. Chris, perhaps you could come in here as well and give us your thoughts before we move on to some of the kind of policy decisions that are facing us.
Thanks, David, and hi, everyone. On the question of whether we should have seen it coming, I think my view is that I think we could have seen it coming in a very long-term sense, but that Trump basically kind of supercharged or accelerated that process, and it's the speed and the suddenness that we couldn't have seen coming. But on the longer-term stuff, to me, if we look at what Labour said before the election and then what they said as they were taking power, so you have basically David Lammy outlines this foreign policy doctrine of progressive realism, as he calls it. And that was kind of the first clue for me. So he put this in a foreign policy article. And to me, it's an attempt to have your cake and eat it. Like he's trying to say, okay, we're going to be both these sort of liberal internationalists promoting progressive goals around the world, as he put it, but also hard-headed realists in the realist tradition of thinking about great power competition and security and the military balance of power and national self-interest. So I think that there's an attempt to kind of do these slightly incompatible things in terms of, I'm not saying it's impossible to have a degree of both, but in terms of paradigms of thinking about foreign policy, he's trying to kind of put these two different things together. So then after the election, I was on the lookout for what would happen in terms of this tension. And my suspicions were largely confirmed in the sense that the first moment that there was some kind of boxing match between the progressive bit and the realist bit, the realist bit enjoyed a knockout in the first round. And that was brought on partly by Starmer's spending review, but I think obviously especially by what's happened with the Trump administration. Firstly, signaling that European countries can't take the US security umbrella for granted anymore. But then secondly, what they've done to US aid. I think kind of firstly that provided it set off this sort of ripple effect in several European countries where you see them taking that signal and reducing their spending. And I think it also provided, like Russell, I'm maybe slightly cynical of Starmer, and I think it provided a political opportunity for him to kind of say, well, this is the way the wind is blowing. Regrettably, we're going to have to shelve our ambitions for 0.7. But I think the bigger backdrop to all of this, and maybe the reason that we could have seen it coming in a longer term sense, is that basically not to be too grandiose, but the end of American unipolarity, the rise of a genuine competitor in China, the return of a more aggressive Russia. I think that's led to a tilt back towards those classic realist preoccupations with balance of power, with security. And so that kind of liberal faith that there can be this happy coincidence between promoting national self-interest and promoting kind of progressive or humanitarian aims, that the current geopolitics makes that seem like it's really faded into the background. So to me, these are kind of big forces that were coming from a long way off, and the Trump administration has just really accelerated that process. And I doubt we can go back to the status quo ante. Which doesn't mean that we can't go forward to a good place, but it'll be a different one. But maybe others can say more about that.
Yeah, no, great. Thanks, Chris, and thanks to your crystal ball as well. I think what we'd like to move on now is to, well, we know that the cuts have happened, and actually they're going to happen very, very quickly. And the FCDO are facing some very difficult decisions to make about where these cuts would fall. Tamsyn, can I come to you and ask you where you think either where they will fall or where they should fall? I'm happy for you to comment on either or both.
Well, first on where they will fall, for those who haven't seen it, there's a very useful letter from Jenny Chapman to the committee, which sets out the broad lines of it. So I've been inside DFID when these sorts of exercises have happened, and then I was at ICAI when we reviewed how they managed expenditure for the meeting the spending target. And when they had to make the major cuts in 2020 and 2021, it was very clear that they'd set out a whole number of priorities. And, you know, at the beginning, you even had Dominic Raab chairing the Star Chamber and, you know, deciding what would stand or fall based on these official priorities. But in practice, they were rather fig leaf-like in their nature, the official priorities, because most of the decisions were made by what was legally binding or very difficult to get out of, or in another way subject to extreme pressure. So a lot of the things that the government said it was going to do as a priority, it just couldn't do at all. It even had to cut back humanitarian, which in general is the most supported area of its work, which it's very reluctant to cut back on because it sees public support every time there's a humanitarian appeal. So what we're seeing from that letter is, at least on the humanitarian side, we're not back to a situation where there's not even enough money in a crisis. There is 100 million in the crisis reserve, for example, and that's going to be crucial. Apart from that, then there are obvious priorities which they are going to maintain, they say, in some way. So Ukraine, Sudan, they're not going to pull back from these. And the OPTs, which obviously have the occupied Palestinian territories, obviously have huge resonance for the Labour base that you were just talking about. And they've also mentioned the overseas territories, but that's, you know, small potatoes, really. I'm sure a lot of the audience is thinking, well, what about research? What's going to happen there? I'm afraid I don't have the answer on that because it doesn't say in the letter. But one of the most interesting things that's happened is that they've decided that the FCDO is going to have a predictable budget. It will no longer have its budget swaying around depending on what other government departments are using. And when it had that role, then the departments outside FCDO funding research, for example, they were cut less because they weren't in that role of the saver of last resort. So now we're going to have a situation, as it explains in the letter, where the Foreign Secretary will chair another kind of Star Chamber exercise. And I you know, I'm not really much of a tipster, but I would guess that probably falls a bit harder on research than it would otherwise. But we shall see how it goes. So those are just a few of the things that you can see there. One of the most interesting things to me is what will happen on the multilateral side. So you were also asking about what should happen. So I'm a trustee of the Center for Global Development, as you mentioned. They had an event in Washington where Nick Dyer set out what he thought were the directions for a world with no aid. And some of those I agree with. For example, prioritizing concessionality for where it's really needed. But it was very striking that they were very much coming from a development rather than a foreign policy perspective. And there are others which are more questionable, where he said you have to become an investor rather than a donor. And that obviously restricts hugely what you can do, because grants are needed for the most challenging situations, and even for climate change, you're only going to get sort of mitigation funded, because it's just you're not going to get the revenue return otherwise. So there could be a long debate on what should happen, but I think what will happen is we're going to see not a chaotic cut, what he called a glide path, but it is going to be very, very severe, and aid will not look the same at the end of it.
No, thank you, and particularly on the insider view as well. That's very interesting. Romilly, I was going to come to you anyway, and ask you, what are you hearing from your members? So all the various NGOs around in the UK that work on development, and what are they doing to try and influence the agenda, I guess, around this?
I wanted to also comment on this point about sort of where the cut should fall, because we worked together with our members to pull together a briefing actually on this. One of them was the issue of in-donor refugee costs, which still, I think it's still something like 20% of ODA. And our sort of feeling was, we've actually been complaining about this for a long time, but now it really is, it's not something that we can continue to, well, we've never supported it, but even more urgent now that we take that money out of the ODA budget. And actually we did a joint piece a couple of weeks ago with the Refugee Council, who were saying, we're spending so much of this money at the moment on hotels. That's also very bad for asylum seekers and refugees, because they're sitting around in hotels for months on end. So, that's a really, really concrete area where we think cuts should fall. Otherwise, we've also thinking about BII, British International Investment, capitalisation. And that's not to say that, we would never have a funding going into BII, but in this particular period, if this is a temporary cut, then actually a lot of money is going into BII, which is much less focused on poverty, it's less focused on climate, it's less focused on fragile states. There are lots of other ways you can spend ODA. And then, again, building on what Tamsyn's just said, really strong focus on leave no one behind and the SDGs for the remainder of the funding, and making sure that we're channeling this scarce resources in the poorest places and the poorest countries. Just picking up on what you quoted from Nick Dyer's point on sort of becoming an investor rather than a donor, we and lots of our members have a real worry that there's going to be a very, very strong focus on private finance now. Now, I'm all in favor of private finance to do things that private finance can do. Great. If you want electricity generation, or, there's lots of great things private finance can do. I think it's a real mistake to think we haven't got enough ODA, let's just ask the private sector to fill the gap. I think that is a mistake. And I think what we should be doing now is thinking about how do we generate much more public finance from other sources, and maybe we can come back to that point.
Yeah, no, thank you, Romilly. And Russell, coming to you also, what are you hearing? Because you're, constantly in Westminster talking to politicians and pundits about this. What's the word from Westminster?
The word from Westminster. So certainly no great nervousness about how this will land with the public. There is a really strong sense inside Labour. This comes through from Politico's reporting, but lots of other outlets as well, that the people at the heart of this, and I remember Nick Maybe saying this was a decision driven by number 10 and number 11. Let's not make any mistake about that. Those guys are sticking by their guns. There's no question for them that they've made the right geopolitical call, pivoting to the US. And if donor funds go by the wayside as a result, then so be it, really. They feel they've made a choice and it's the right one. So there is pushback, of course. You talked about Jenny Chapman. There are some very strong voices. I'm sometimes a little bit surprised we don't get a bit more from people like Rory Stewart, who was such a champion of this stuff. There's Swain, who his political opinions have gone off in all sorts of places in the last 4 or 5 years. But I remember when he was a DFID minister, and he was an incredible salesman for this idea of getting money out the door, soft power benefits, a very conservative oriented argument that you could have heard from any of the main parties. They've all gone silent. I actually think there's something about those kind of outriders who could be doing a bit more of a job to help those of you guys on the call who are actually still in the sector trying to make it work. But the overriding sense in Westminster is we're not about to see any reversal of this soon. If it's all right, David, I'll add one quick point. So before I joined Politico, I wrote, as some of you will know, about charities for 4 or 5 years at Third Sector and at civil society. And so I looked back before this at some of the reporting we did back in 2021 when the first cuts came down. I'm amused. I hadn't realized that government was talking about a glide path I think some very clever comms person has come up with that somewhere. I don't think this is going to feel like a glide path to the organizations who are being told that their funding is getting cut. Some of the stories we did at the time, I remember interviewing someone who got an email overnight. They were running, it was an anonymous source, so I won't say which country, but they were running a small service for girls at risk of being married while they were still children. And they got an email overnight from their kind of government contact saying, your funding is ending. And that was it. There was no call. There was no gentle kind of runway to help them prepare. It was, you used to have funding and now you don't. Please make other arrangements with other donors. We also reported a story, I should say the FCDO denied this very strongly, but it was also very well sourced from us, that a charity had been told by government officials, look, if you're stretched for cash and we're about to cut your money, have you considered just making all of your local staff redundant, because you won't have to pay the extra redundancy payments, unlike your UK staff, where maybe you'd have different legal requirements. Obviously, the idea those noises were coming out of government. As I say, government denied this, but we were extremely well sourced on the fact that it had happened. It tells you something about how bloody it can get on the ground when these things are happening. So whether or not any of that will be powerful enough to start turning heads inside the Commons or among peers who are like, oh, blimey neck, what have we just done? Probably not. It didn't last time. But there's a very, very kind of tough few months ahead, especially small charities working on the ground. Getting Westminster to pay attention when that starts happening might move the dial a wee bit.
Yeah, Jimm, can I come to you next, actually, on that precisely that point? Because you spend your time advising CSOs on their strategies and how they should work. What are you hearing from the people and organizations that you're working with, and what's your advice to them at the moment, given that we're in this context where the UK aid budget is being almost halved and the kind of things that Russ is talking about? Like, what's your advice?
Well, first of all, there's the recognition that there's been a long-standing over-reliance on external forms of support, like funding from the UK government amidst other external donors, and external to our countries, to our region, to our continent. And given this realization, it has often boxed us or made us to function as, to an extent, stooges, to another extent, responding to what may not necessarily be our priorities at a particular point in time. Taking into consideration these observations, these realities that exist, that are on the ground, many of our partners, the stakeholders we interact with, that is civil society organizations on the continent, in the region, are more aware or awakened on the need to find ways to explore our own more. What are those ways or avenues that we can tap into, that we can leverage on, to complement whatever may or exists that can support our work? So in working with different organizations, first it's highlighting that awareness, realizing that we need to look within, because with us, in us, among us, we have some elements that can really enable us to respond to the challenges around us. And these elements include resources, more so financial resources. And here is a time when we are talking local philanthropy, community philanthropy, alumni giving, diaspora giving, and all these are avenues that, as we are working with organizations, enabling them to think through strategy, enabling them to think through our sustainability. What are those ways that we can pin on resources we have more control over, resources we have more influence, to direct how they will come and what they are going to go into, as opposed to resources that, yes, we can leverage on, but we have little or no control, one, nor influence to direct how they will come to us. So in current conversations, these are really things that we are exchanging, exploring with different organizations, and we are seeing more buy-in, from organizations in the region. And we believe that in the years to come, we will be having, more data points to really showcase how well these avenues to dip into and pull resources from, are contributing significantly to drive the agendas that we are defining for ourselves.
Thank you, Jimm. That's very helpful. And I suspect we've all heard somebody in terms of a moment of dark humor over the past month or two say, well, one way of interpreting this is the ultimate shifting of power, right? This is decolonization in hyperspeed, but it's certainly not the smooth runway that we were talking about. Chris, I come to you for your thoughts.
Yeah, on that exactly. One thing that I've been interested in among the many things is how this intersects with the localization agenda, which to me localization seems to be in some way how the kind of development practice is responding to that maybe underlying idea of decolonization. But what Jimm was saying just then made me think about that as well, this issue of dependence, as you called it, of frontline organizations being too dependent on Western aid. But yeah, I mean, exactly as you just said, David, to me, there's a really dramatic irony here, which is that many people who have a kind of critical perspective on international development have been arguing for years about localization, #shift the power. Many of us have been strongly critical of the way that the USA has operated, from its perch as unipolar hegemon, and the role that USAID has arguably played within that. And it's really weird that Trump seems to have decided that now it's okay to go kind of explicitly imperialist vis-a-vis Greenland, Panama, Gaza, but then at the same time he's gutted the organization that critics on the left have been accusing for years of being essentially this kind of neo-imperialist operation. But so the interesting question is that, yeah, as part of this, Western development actors are really going to shed a lot of power, and that's a major part of what some people have been arguing for in localization or decolonizing aid, and de facto local organizations are going to have to attempt to fill the gap. But of course, shift the power was also about shift the resources, I think, if it was going to mean anything. And obviously, very few advocates of decolonizing development would have argued simply for gutting Western aid in one fell swoop, because obviously that has terrible human consequences. So what's happening is not so much #shift the power as #shift the responsibility, if you like. But I have a kind of question for the panelists and probably also for the audience, those of you working in development. Is there some kind of opportunity here, or a crisis-opportunity, if you like? Like, is this a moment where increased South-South cooperation, increased locally led activity might lead to a different model of development? Now, I think that the transition to get there probably would involve a lot of human suffering, frankly. But that's a question for the other panelists and for those of you in the audience. Is this a crisis-opportunity for actually doing some of these things that people have been arguing about for ages?
Yeah, and I think etymologically, crisis means choice. So you're exactly right. And yes, you're anticipating my questions, Chris. Thank you. Brilliant. Romilly, you were going to come in on this, I think.
Yeah, I wanted to say two things on that. One is the risk is with the US that actually the remaining funding is so poor quality. This is what we're hearing from a lot of our members, that even now when they're saying we are going to preserve some of the life saving and the humanitarian, it's like completely the opposite of localization. It's like sort of old-fashioned, all the kind of stuff I used to study when I was a development studies student years ago, sort of, dumping and tide aid and all the rest of it. So I think that's the sort of the danger, not only that we're seeing these cuts, but the remaining funding is going to be such poor quality, particularly from the US side. But the other point I wanted to make, going back to what I was saying earlier on the public finance, that what we're hearing from a lot of our members and their partners and our civil society networks around the world is, thinking about things like debt, tax, and illicit flows as other really important things that we need to tackle to raise some of that more public finance. And actually, the governance of those becomes really important now. So in terms of the Financing for Development conference that's happening in a couple of months or so, what we hear from a lot of LMIC civil society and governments is that the governance of those things really matters. So UN tax convention, UN mechanisms for debt restructuring. I think that is, so I don't like to use the word opportunity because the suffering here is so immense, and so for me it's not quite the right word. But I think this is a moment, and we've talked about pivoting with armament, of thinking about how do we raise public financing from other sources and how do we get the governance right to make some of those key decisions and actually really shift the power so that governments and LMIC voices have a much stronger say than they do at the moment. And actually, I think this is something for the UK government. They keep saying, oh, we're regretful about having to make these cuts, we still want to be out there. And I think our argument to them is, okay, well, you have to listen to some of these calls around, much stronger voice from LMICs in some of the global mechanisms. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Romilly. And yeah, a good reminder as well. Tamsyn.
Yeah, I wanted to pick up on the localization and just to refer to what Russ said earlier. When I said Nick was talking about a glide path, then actually his point was that it's over 3 years, whereas all those earlier cuts I was talking about had to happen in a year. So they actually had to pause the whole of aid spending, so a bit more dramatic. But you're totally right about the pain for charities. And one of the things that will probably concern a lot of people in the audience is that Nick Dyer said that in this new world, there's going to be a lot less charity. But he did say it would be more localization. And that was actually the most interesting thing that he said in many ways. The trouble is that my cynical side is coming up in thinking about what that means. It's absolutely brilliant to hear what you were saying, Jimm. And, in my ideal world, that would be a signal that the FCDO was going to put serious effort into supporting organizations like yours, which bring together civil society and help them work out how they are going to bring in their own resources. So the power genuinely shifts to you. The trouble is that doesn't necessarily fit so well with what they're doing. I also really love the idea of major changes in governance, in the world's most important institutions, but I see absolutely no sign that the British government is going to support that. It always comes to they're always very supportive of change, except when it comes to the point where they have to give up their own seat on the Security Council or their shareholding or whatever. So not so hopeful on that.
Jimm, yes. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tamsyn, for that call. And really, that is something, of course, WAXI will gladly embrace that, particularly because together with Barton, we engaged in a process of consolidating perspectives on how centrally managed funds, could be best positioned, so that they are managed in a way that respond to the interests of those communities that need the funds the most. And, I will share the link to the report that came out of that process. But one key thing that emerged from that, which is something, that the current government can explore, which will definitely be in their interest, is the element of trust-based funding, which is, yes, you have the resources. You want it to serve your interest and, of course, the interest of the partners, the stakeholders that you're collaborating with. But how can you, manage that, explore that collaboration opportunity in a way that demonstrates trust, in a way that gives every stakeholder along that journey that ability to have a say, to have their voice, but most importantly, to be heard, listened to in a way that collectively we can build not only common goals, but of course, achieve common results and lessons that will help us to improve on our practice. And irrespective of the quantum of financial resources that are put into such a process, it is just important that, the current government explores that trust-based mentality and approach to make sure that, of course, they stand out as a leader in the current era, even though it's not an ideal era. Thank you.
Thank you. We've got about 5 minutes left before we shift to Q&A. And we've got questions coming in here, I can see, from the participants, which are really excellent. So I want to give those a bit of time. But I suppose a final question then to everyone is, in terms of, and Russ, you mentioned this, I think, a little bit earlier in terms of the public and where the public is on these things. And do we think that it's possible to rebuild the case for development with the public? And given what we're talking about in terms of the governance of international institutions, other ways of creating resource through taxation, etc., and what Jimm, you were talking about in terms of remittances, etc. What does that case look like? What is that vision for development that needs to emerge? Yeah, Romilly.
So I think with the public, a couple of things. One is when you talk to the public, it very much depends on the question that you ask people. So generally, if you say, do you like aid, or would you rather have the money spent on the NHS or education? Lo and behold, people say no. If you say things like, do you want people to be vaccinated? They say yes. And I was really struck in my last role throughout the pandemic. We did some public polling every 3 months, roughly, throughout the whole pandemic around COVID vaccine sharing. So we were running a big campaign on that. And we were asking people, do we think it's important for people to be vaccinated in other parts of the world? Consistently, a majority said yes. And at one point, we were even saying, should we be prioritizing health workers in other parts of the world over young and healthy people here? Not everybody said yes, but there was still a really, really large number of people that said, yes, let's prioritize health workers, those who really need vaccines. So, I think there is a real strong element of support. The other thing that we found is if you talk about spending money on poverty reduction, gender equality, those sorts of things, that resonates much better with the public actually than discussion around sort of national interest, short-term national interest arguments. So I think that there is a lot of support there, probably not for, less so government aid versus other forms of government spending, but actually on internationalism, there is an awful lot of support, and particularly amongst certain voters. So I think it's around having a stronger story. And there's one thing I would say to the politicians, we hear a lot from politicians that, oh, the public don't support this. Actually, when you have politicians going out and making the case and making the argument for some of these things, that also helps with support. So I think it's something we need to work on together. But it's a very lively debate within Bond and our membership.
Excellent. Russ, I'll come to you before we'll open it up to questions.
Thank you so much. The public only care about one thing right now, which is they think the world is insecure and falling apart, and Britain is falling apart, and they want it fixed. So any campaign has to fit within that. And I'll say very, very quickly, and I'm sorry, this is probably a typical journalist thing to say, I get press releases all the time from big aid charities. I'm not going to name them, but they're essentially just fundraising pleas wrapped up with a decent story. They're boring. We never cover them. If there is going to be a smart 2-year campaign to try and get back on the front foot for saying why aid is important, don't let those big charities run them, because they're very, very good at what they do, but they are not great big team collegiate players. They've got they've got their financial targets to hit, and they're very much ingrained in that stuff, and they're not very good at engaging with journalists, to be honest with you. So I would get someone else to front it up, maybe some of those NHS folk that we've already mentioned.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. Right. So far, really, really great. Thank you to our panel. And questions have been coming in. And so let me put these to you. And whoever feels like they want to have a punt and answer it, just stick your hand up and we will go to you. So the first question here is from Dominic Glover. And Dominic asks, will the skills and expertise of development scholars and practitioners continue to be in demand in this new world? And how would you expect the development sector to evolve professionally and organisationally? Will it stay in its recognisable form? And in this context, would you think that a development studies degree programmes will continue to be in demand? So who would like to have a comment on that? Yeah, Tamsyn.
So this is something that we obviously talk about a lot in our board meetings, because I'm a board member at the Institute for Development Studies, and we started to be concerned that it's not just the impact of the government's choices on visas, that there's less interest in development studies worldwide. In fact, the IDS does pretty well compared to other places. But the trend seems to be for there being less interest in young people gaining the expertise of development-related degrees. And there's more of a shift to what overlaps considerably with it, but is a different framing, which is interesting, more on the green side, on climate, environment, and sustainable development. So that's something that I think needs to be thought hard about. Demand for development expertise more broadly. Well, one of the other things Nick Dyer said, for what it's worth, is it was going big on, in a non-aid world, the expertise offer. Obviously, that has to be financed somehow. So it's back to the era of lots of technical assistance is what that means. And actually, the big research funds were officially categorized as technical assistance. I personally don't think it would be so great if there's a lot of this scarce resource which goes into research which no one has asked for. What's really needed by developing country governments or other key stakeholders, that's where it should start from, rather than it being thought up here, what's interesting, and expect to get that funded by aid. That's not to say there aren't other legitimate sources of funding, but in a scarce world, I think it really has to be prioritized.
Yeah, Romilly.
Yeah, I was going to just build on that, because I very much have that anxiety as well. There's going to be a lot about sort of British expertise, sort of going around the world and sort of sharing British experience, which it's not a bad thing in and of itself. But I think the kind of expertise that will be needed in a new world will actually be much more about this local partnership building on some of the things that Jimm was talking about sort of trust-based partnership, long-term financing. Is going to be much more, or it certainly should be much more, about how do you build relationships? How do you support movements? How do you support local partners? How do you find, build the right kind of partnerships? I think that will remain important. I think we probably still have a bit of an advocacy job to do, if I'm honest. Talking to the government on that has to be the way to work. And, in a situation of lower ODA resources, you need to think even harder about spending that money well and building some of that kind of long-term relationship. So I think that's how expertise will shift, as well as, I think there still will be a need for some of these sort of global public goods, thinking about climate, thinking about health, security, peace building, those sorts of things. So I think those are the two directions it's likely to go in.
Yeah. Okay. Chris.
Yes, it's probably falls to me to talk about academic development studies. Within our department at Birmingham, as you know, David, we've had debates about what teaching development even means now. And I think that's even more pressing after what's happened in the last year. I think definitely studying, if studying development in the past has meant something like studying what donors and NGOs do, I think that is probably over. But I think sometimes we overstate the extent to which development is just this kind of Western idea or even a Western imposition. There's a rich pedigree of thinking about development from the global South, the dependency theorists, and so on. And I think we shouldn't be too hasty to assume that if Western aid declines, that means the end of thinking about development. I think that there are other traditions of thinking about development that are valuable and old, and that we will still study. But I think we will still study development, and I think there will still be value in a development studies degree, although you might think I would say that. But I think it will have more of an emphasis on studying development in the sense of social historical change, and probably less in the sense of being so squarely focused on aid, because that is where the world will have gone. It will have moved away from the old model of aid, as much as was previously the case.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Chris. Yeah, Jimm.
Just to say that, one thing that needs to be taken into account is, leveraging on practice, leveraging on the rich savoir-faire, rich know-how of those who are actually doing, as opposed to the existing approach where those teaching development, let me take it from that standpoint, are predominantly those who have studied it theoretically. I've been privileged, to share my experience in classrooms, in universities, and the response we often get when staff from WACSI deliver sessions, practice-based sessions in master's programs to PhD students, the kind of response that it generates, the kind of appetite, the kind of connection that the learners get between what they have been studying from theory and what a practitioner brings on board is eye-opening. And it's just something that I think we need to encourage more. That yes, development studies need to be encouraged. However, those delivering specific elements of these programs, we need to create a balance wherein, I would dare say there is a high proportion, not higher, maybe 50-50 between the academics, the predominantly academics, and practitioners, those who have actually worked in war-torn zones in the northwest and southwest regions of Cameroon, worked in humanitarian crisis zones in the Democratic Republic of Congo, because such practice and theory, combinations will give, will build richer and better, students and practitioners in the near future. Thank you.
Very well said, Jim. Thank you for that. All right, another question here from Peter Taylor, a very contemporary question. Canada has just elected a government that's more inclined to progressive change. Should we, the UK that is, be looking to connect up with an emerging axis of progressive policies in countries such as Canada, Brazil, South Africa, and Spain to bolster the kind of development cooperation we're keen to rekindle? Chris.
Yeah, yes, that's the answer. No, yeah, I mean, it's really interesting, the result that's just come in from Canada with the Liberals winning, and the fact that, I mean, that's quite a surprising turnaround for them. But I think we had an earlier question about how to rebuild the case for UK aid, and I think there's a kind of clue there in this Canadian result, because a lot of the UK public, even if they're quite conservative leaning, that according to polls, as far as I know, they're still not very enamored with Trump at all, and I mean, they're appalled by Trump's approach to Russia-Ukraine, for example. So I think there's a sort of, well, maybe Russ can set me straight here, but at least rhetorically, at least that's the space in which the argument would need to be made, as almost a sort of like defiance to Trump. That Trump has America has gone rogue. We need to be a bit more independent of America. We stand for what we've always stood for, and a significant commitment to aid is part of that. So I think the Canada result is really interesting, and it shows how, in terms of UK domestic politics, maybe Trump and kind of anti-Trump sentiment might be the lever to pull if you want to make the case for aid.
Romilly and then Russell.
Yeah, unsurprisingly, I agree with that. And bear in mind, the UK is going to host the G20 in a couple of years. And then it's going to host the G7 the year after. So 2027, we're going to have the G20 host. US is hosting it next year. So let's see how that goes. But in a sense, you've had a lot of progressive commitments from Brazil. You've got South Africa this year, next year, as I say, we'll see how it goes. And then it's UK. And then, by the way, we've got the G7 the year after. So, I think there is a real opportunity. And I completely agree, Christopher, that it's so interesting. Mark Carney, who's been a massive champion on climate finance, all these sort of, what might have been seen very sort of globalist, multilateral cooperation, tackling global public goods. Clearly the Canadians are all in favour of that. And I think there are some real lessons here for us in the UK. And I think planning ahead to the G20 and the G7 and using those as moments to try and do some of that trust rebuilding would be really sensible.
Yeah, thanks, Romilly. Russell.
I'll answer Chris's point very quickly, as he invited me to. Yes, there is an absolute ton of space in public opinion to win support with an anti-Trump stance for obvious reasons, and I think the closeness to Putin and how that develops is only going to make that bigger and bigger. The UK's response to the Ukraine crisis has been very clear and stable for so many years. No one's looking happily at the idea that that's going to get turned on its head by Trump. So that's basically going to get bigger. That's a very, very difficult decision, I think, for campaigners and advocates and lobbyists for this, because where that argument won't hold much truck is Downing Street. And ultimately, if the decision to rebuild trust is now, and maybe with a very similar looking government after 2029, how much are you going to win a lot of public support using anti-Trump arguments, but not get anywhere at all with your key political advisors inside government who can actually pull some levers when you need them to? Because those guys are, again, absolutely convinced they've made the right call. Trump on one side, aid on the other, cut the aid, help Trump. They think that's the right call, and they're not going to be hugely amenable, I think, to a campaign that says that Trump guy, we still be running away from him because they're doing the opposite.
Okay, excellent. I think we've got time for one final quick question. I'm going to put two together to create it, and it's from Akwayemi Claude Akinsanya, who asks about the extent to which we should lean into private corporations and investors, and how do we prevent exploitation? We've touched on that already, I think, but there's another question by Zelia Vital about looking at religious organizations and faith groups. And I suppose the question here is both about whether that's a source of money and also whether that's a constituency, and especially when you think about the US, whether that's a constituency that can lobby from a slightly different perspective on the importance of these more internationalist aims, I guess. So I don't know if anyone wants to take on that double-headed question. Yeah, Romilly.
Yeah, so in terms of the faith groups, absolutely. And we see that here, many of our members are, different forms of faith group, and actually their membership is held up really well across different faiths. And similarly in the US, I know that a lot of the kind of church groups, I know less about some of the other faiths there, it has been a constituency, and it's often a much more kind of solid and active constituency. So I think that that's a really important area to keep engaging with. David, sorry, your first question's just fallen out of my head. What was the first?
About prevent leaning into the private sector, prevent
yeah,
becoming exploitation.
I just, as I said earlier, I think that's an important conversation to have. I think you go wrong if you sort of suddenly think private sector can do things that public sector really needs to do. I think that there is the damage, and I just think sometimes it gets very kind of lazy that we sort of lump all these things together and we say, oh, it's money, we need money for development. And I think there is a real risk in the Financing for Development conference that becomes a lot about the private sector, and I think that's the wrong direction to go.
Yeah, okay. Thank you. I think that's all we've got time for. Jimm, if I could come to you perhaps for a last word. There is a couple of comments in the chat from Alina Rocha Menakal, who makes the case that in the UK we often think about development as happening elsewhere, rather than in the UK itself, and that we should be, and I think this is to Chris's point, we should be decolonizing the idea of development itself. Is that a priority from where you're sat? Sorry, Jimm, I'm not sure you heard my question.
Yeah, I didn't get the question. Sorry.
Okay. It's the question is that often in the UK, development is something that is considered to happen elsewhere, and that we should be thinking about decolonizing the very idea of development. And I wonder whether that's a priority from where you're sat.
Well, I think it is a priority, to decolonize the development, because, in taking into consideration some of the parameters that define what, colonial development agenda is. The advocate for that development agenda, we have the know-how. We prioritize our own agenda and our own goals and our own tools and resources here, knowledge resources, as opposed to what exists, say, in West Africa. And so it's really important for there to be a reconsideration of this, to acknowledge that there are resource persons on the continent, there is knowledge on the continent, there are resources on the continent, and there are people with the know-how to define and drive our own development priorities. And if these basic elements are taken into consideration in practice, not in theory, in practice, not in policy documents, we will definitely be moving towards a trajectory of decolonizing development, which is something that is urgently needed like now.
Thank you, Jimm. And we have come to the top of the hour. I think it's been a really wonderful discussion. So lots of great insights and things to look out for in the future as well, in terms of looking ahead, G7, financing for development, all of these things are crucially important. So thank you to Romilly, Tamsyn, Russ, Chris, and Jimm. And thank you to all of us joining the presentation. I wish everyone a very good day. Thank you and bye-bye.
Thanks, David.